Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture. You haven't seen me in a while, but I have been working on a few different sort of projects that are like, maybe turn into books or something like that. I'm not really sure exactly what to do with all of this. But I have been, theory crafting or whatever, let's say. And one of the things I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to give a kind of summary or kind of the skeleton of some of the intellectual history that I've been working with recently. And so basically, what I've been thinking about is certain pathologies within left wing intelligentsia, and this isn't like I know that I think I have some people in my audience who are like traditional Marxists and stuff like that. This doesn't really apply to you, the kinds of criticisms that I'm going to talk about, but you'll hopefully you find this interesting anyway. But yeah, so the other day on Twitter, it's been a while now. I've just been busy and sick and stuff like that. I had surgery too. There's been a lot going on. But anyway, so there was a conversation the other day on Twitter between Matt McManus and Amy Therese. And the conversation went something like Amy Therese accused the left of not reading the right. Matt McManus, truthfully responded to that saying, yeah, there is a lot of left-wing material on the right. I've written books on the right. Here's one of my books. Look, I've got chapters on Thomas Carlyle and Demeist and whatever. And la-di-da. So, and not, this isn't obviously a phenomenon that's limited to McManus. You get Adorno reading Heidegger, you get Habermas reading sort of the history of Western philosophy altogether, etc. This happens a lot. There's a lot of left-wing commentary on right-wing thinkers, right? However, I think that Amy Therese is onto something that is correct, all right? And I saw this same scenario sort of repeat itself a few days later or something like that, where again somebody was saying something to the effect of the left doesn't read the right. Matt McManus was saying something like, of course we do, here's my book, buy it. I've engaged quite a bit in the past with McManus. But anyway, I think that what is happening here is actually there's a kind of dispute, like a categorical dispute. What does it mean to read? What does it mean what would it mean for the left to read the right? The left certainly, looks at texts by the right and produces commentaries on those texts and produces, more. I would say there's, intelligentsia in general is left leaning. And so there's way more commentary by left wing thinkers, let's say academics, on right wing thought or right wing cultural phenomena or whatever. There's way more of that. However, I don't think that they're actually reading the right. And I think that there are important reasons for that, actually. What they're doing, and I think I've pointed this out before on Twitter, but what they're doing, so for example, there's a Matt McManus article on Michael Millerman's book and his treatment of Dugin and stuff like that. And I read this article at some point thinking that I might make do a kind of review of that review. And when I read it, I was like, at no point in this article does he entertain the possibility that what Dugin or Millerman or Heidegger is saying is true. At no point is there any actual argumentation. There's no argumentation that anything that comes out of Dugin, Millerman, Heidegger is false, is wrong, right? It's not contested. That ground is left unexplored. What happens is what always happens, which is not reading as a kind of thoughtful engagement with written material as a potential source of truth, as potentially illuminating, right? What it is just a kind of normative screening, right? And so they evaluate the text by trying to sort of morally condemn it, trying to distance themselves from it, trying to neuter it or something like that. This has been the approach to, systematically to people like Heidegger or Nietzsche or whatever, for a long time. I've said things like, Nietzsche, there was a Nietzscheanization of the left. What that really means is there was a kind of hemiplegic operation performed on Nietzsche in order to make him consistent with the normative commitments of left-wing intelligentsia. That's what really happened. And so what these people are doing has nothing to do with any sort of concern for the truth or for the validity of anything that they're reading. When I read, I'm, like Millerman will say, like a philosophical supremacist. And so, for example, in the book that or in the essay I have a video on by Nancy Fraser, Foucault, a Young Conservative, I was really struck by that. And I think that it's very indicative of what I'm talking about here. And she's very honest. She's open and honest about it, which is unusual. But what she says in that essay, she's like, okay, Habermas views Foucault as a young conservative. He's too contaminated by right-wing thought. His thought is, it has a family resemblance to the thinkers of the conservative revolution, right? And so Habermas's view is we should really just drop Foucault, And the reason that he has this kind of family resemblance is that Foucault is what he calls like a total rejectionist of modernity, a la Nietzsche, stuff like that, right? And so he's like, okay, so Foucault is like this, right? He's a total rejectionist. And he wants to say people like Adorno, the Frankfurt School, you have the dialectic of the Enlightenment and stuff like that. There are criticisms of the Enlightenment there, but he wants to say they're not total rejectionists. I want to say in my intellectual history that it's kind of a moment along this kind of historical trajectory. But in any event, he calls him a total rejectionist, says we should abandon him, because the implications of what Foucault is doing fundamentally do not lend themselves to left-wing political projects, right? They do not. A rejection of the metaphysics, of the ontology, of Enlightenment, modern humanism, right? Which is what Foucault is doing. It rug pulls everything about progressive politics. You're not able to maintain any kind of philosophical coherence, having abandoned Enlightenment metaphysics, but carrying on Enlightenment moral commitments, right? It doesn't make any sense. And so that's why Habermas is saying Foucault should be dropped. The left shouldn't engage with him. And again, I feel like this is true. I feel like Foucault actually really belongs on the right. His behaviors, his actual, his biographical political commitments sort of beside, in terms of what he's doing philosophically, I think that's the case. But Nancy Fraser in her essay, what she does is she says, okay, let's evaluate. Let's take this claim seriously. Should we abandon Foucault, right? Because, as you know, probably, Foucault is something like the most cited scholar in the humanities or whatever. And so he's enormously influential. Left-wing academics love him, even though, again, I would say something like they are his enemy, philosophically. But so she says, okay, let's take this claim seriously. Let's consider whether Foucault is a total rejectionist, and we're going to analyze his rejection of modern humanism, of the Enlightenment, along a few different trajectories, right? A few different axes. The first one that she talks about, if you recall, is philosophical. Is he a philosophical rejectionist of modernity? Does he, that is, reject any notion of objectivity, of a Cartesian subject, of the idea of a universal human nature, et cetera, right? All of the sort of metaphysical commitments of the Enlightenment. And he does. She concludes that he does. So and she keeps going. She's like, so he's a philosophical rejectionist. Does that mean that we can't use him anymore? To someone like me, to someone on the right, yes, that means you can't use him anymore. It means if you accept that level of his analysis, then you cannot dogmatically promote or advocate for this kind of political program that you are. These norms are founded on a metaphysics that has been dismantled, that you agree is wrong, right? And so that requires you to like think about what you're doing and do something else, just discover a new foundation or something. But she decides that that's not sufficient. And so she goes on to think about whether he is a normative rejectionist and a strategic rejectionist. And so basically the question is, well, but can we still use him for our purposes? Can we still deploy Foucault in the service of these norms? Do we see in Foucault a philosophical rejection of Enlightenment normativity? Yes, she concludes yes. Yes, you do see that. And she concludes basically throughout the whole thing, like, yes, at every level he's a rejectionist, right? And so that's a bummer. If he was if he rejected the foundations of everything that we believe and do, that'd be fine, as long as we could continue to pretend that he supports our normative commitments or whatever, that those aren't, abolished by Foucauldian analysis too, etc. But unfortunately they are. So at the end of the book, if you recall, she says something like, if that's what discipline means, I guess I'm for it. And I was like, yeah, you are. That's what you are. That's what your political program ultimately is. And it's totally incompatible with Foucault. But anyway, I see her as being very open and honest and explicit about exactly what I'm talking about there. The left does not read the right. The left screens the right for conformity to their moral commitments, right? It's a kind of moral screening. And so the questions that are asked are things like, does what's being said here promote fascism? Can this be used by people who think bad things or whatever? Is this going to undermine our commitment to equality, inclusion, autonomy, whatever, right? And so those are the kinds of questions that are asked. They do not ask the question, is this true? Which is sort of the most fundamental question in my mind that you should ask when you are engaging with a text, with a philosophical text. And so I would say, no, they don't read. But the thing about this is, I don't think that this is like bad faith or whatever. I hate that terminology. But I don't think that that's what's going on here. I think that it's a structural problem. Like I was indicating a little bit, I think that there is an intrinsic philosophical incoherence on the left that requires that they repress fundamental questions. They have to repress metaphysics and ontology. And I think that's why you see, like even in this recent Sam Cedar debate and stuff like that, or the what is a woman stuff or whatever, we observe constantly that people on the left can't answer questions like that. They can't answer questions like that because they at least imply metaphysical commitments that they are not allowed to, that they are not allowed to commit themselves to, right? And part of that is because they just have this free-floating normativity. Metaphysics and normativity have separated off in terms of our intellectual history. They repress metaphysical questions, and so they have this free-floating normativity, and they're like, okay, so I'm committed to inclusion. I don't know why. I don't know what the philosophical foundations for why I should care about inclusion are in the first place. I'm going to make the kinds of arguments against my opponents that indicate that any possible foundation for me to care about inclusivity, I don't subscribe to. But I'm very committed to inclusivity. And so what that means is as soon as you say something like, a woman is this, it doesn't matter what it is. A woman is this. If you define it culturally or biologically or cognitively or whatever the hell you're doing, genetically, I don't know. Any sort of axis along which you would apply or subscribe to a definition implies something, a fundamental belief about the nature of reality, right? And as soon as you do that, you exclude. If I define woman biologically, I immediately, in the same moment, exclude everyone who doesn't fit this sort of biological definition of what a woman is. If I define it culturally or whatever, we see the same thing with nationhood, right? In the Sam Cedar debate, again, this question about what is American identity. He cannot answer that question. He couldn't answer the question about what is a nation, what is a people. He would be incapable of answering any question like that at all because it implies it implies an ontology, and an ontology is anathema because of a variety of reasons that we'll sort of get into here or whatever. So in terms of the history, right, the history of the left, the intellectual history of the left, as I think I've talked before about, like, the left and right, this is French Revolution stuff. This is, on the one hand, you have, like, hierarchy, tradition, traditional authority, the church, the primacy of the church, things like that, monarchy, whatever. On the other hand, you have this, what is sort of authentically Enlightenment thought, which is like individual autonomy, freedom, rights, republican or liberal forms of government, free enterprise, freedom of conscience, et cetera, and equality. And so these are sort of the two things. They oppose one another, and that's left and right. And the left then, at that point, they are rooted in Enlightenment ontology, and they have an Enlightenment ontology, right? And the idea that we should care about things like human rights, that we believe in things like equality, etc., those flow from this metaphysical foundation. If I believe in a kind of universal human nature, then I can be committed in praxis to the norm of equality, right? I can be egalitarian or whatever because I believe all human beings are fundamentally the same. I believe in a universal human nature. Okay, so all of these normative commitments, they flow from this metaphysical foundation. They're coherent at this point, right? Over time, again, there's a lot here that I have to just sort of ignore. But over time, what happens is, well, first of all, you get sort of the victory of Enlightenment liberals, right? And the West becomes an Enlightenment liberal sort of place. They're empowered. So then you go from a kind of first generation of liberals to a second generation of liberals. The first generation are concerned with sort of reducing external power, the power of the state, or whatever, specifically the power of the state, because they're confronting Catholic monarchical states. Right? So they want to reduce the power. Once they take over, and you have liberal, democratic, republican, whatever regimes, then the people are empowered. The Enlightenment left is empowered. And so then their push for greater inclusion, equality, individual autonomy, et cetera, goes into a sort of different register. Then they want to empower the state to work for increasing equality and things like that by confronting, traditional institutions, the authority of the church, cultural norms and mores and stuff like that, and business, and the power of, independent businesses that become very wealthy or whatever. Right. So this is a sort of transition to the second generation of liberals, or the second generation of the left, I would say, or something like that, in modernity. Now, over time, what happens with this process, right? The historical development of the left, is that their critique increasingly deploys ideas that come from the counter-Enlightenment. And the counter-Enlightenment is associated with the right. They're the people who are on the side of tradition, hierarchy, authority, monarchy, et cetera, right? They're reacting against the Enlightenment. And a lot of them do this. People like Heyman, for example, or Jacobi or whatever, they're like addressing people like Kant. But a lot of what's going on in the counter-Enlightenment, what they're doing is they're attacking Enlightenment metaphysics, right? They're attacking the idea of a universal human nature. They're attacking the idea that the world is transparent to secular rationality. They're attacking all of these things. And the intellectual trajectory of what's going on in the counter-Enlightenment, these ideas, over time, like, how do these ideas manifest themselves today? Postmodern thought is counter-Enlightenment thought. All their ideas are just taken from the counter-Enlightenment. They are the contemporary version intellectually of the counter-Enlightenment, but now they're progressive. Okay. However, progressive politics is about these Enlightenment normative commitments. It's this Enlightenment moralizing, right? The Enlightenment moralizing grows out of this kind of foundation metaphysically of the Enlightenment, what's shared by people, from Locke to Kant or whatever. Kant, I think of as in a sort of unique position because he recognizes some of these problems we're talking about better than anyone else and really tries to resolve them. But ultimately, what we're talking about is, right, there is over time an absorption of the ideas of the counter-Enlightenment by the left, and they become, postmodern, they become historicist, they become phenomenological, whatever. And these are rooted in the counter-Enlightenment, which has a very different conception of metaphysics. They grow out of the counter-Enlightenment sort of approach to metaphysics and ontology, which is totally opposed to, it's totally in opposition to the Enlightenment metaphysics. That's why they have, they were consistent. And you see someone like Nietzsche, he's consistent. I would associate Nietzsche with like the counter-Enlightenment. And he's a sort of consistent application of these kinds of critiques, right? You wind up in a position where Nietzsche is right-wing, right? Now, it's a major problem when you when you have a kind of postmodern approach to ontology and metaphysics, but you have the normativity of the Enlightenment. These two things are in contradiction. You can't have any kind of philosophical coherence if you have taken up the Enlightenment critique of the counter-Enlightenment thinkers via things like even critical theory to some extent, but especially postmodernism and stuff. If you've taken up this critique of Enlightenment metaphysics, then everything that grounds the political project of the left, of Enlightenment moralizing, whatever, is gone, right? And so you have this structural problem on the left, where I think the reason they don't read the right is because they can't, right? It would produce too much cognitive dissonance or whatever, because as soon as they start to consider the question of, is this true, right? What do I think the ultimate nature of reality is like? What do I think human nature is like? What do I actually think about objectivity? What do I think about the idea of a Cartesian subject, whatever, etc.? Once they start actually thinking about things like that, what they would find is that what they think in the sort of register of metaphysics contradicts everything they think in the domain of normativity. So they've really just repressed all of these questions altogether, and they just operate according to this sort of free-floating normativity. And it's incoherent, right? I'm trying to see what else I have in my notes here for what I wanted to say about this. But yeah, I mean, if you just think for a moment, like, I want equality. I want equality between men and women. What does that require that you believe? It requires that you believe man and woman mean something. If those are historically contingent discursive formations, and man and woman aren't true ontological categories, there's no such thing as the essence of a man or a woman, let's say, then it is incoherent to champion equality between men and women, right? If there's no such thing as, truth or objective morality or something like that, like if I make the argument something like homosexuality is wrong, right? I make this argument, this has happened in real life or whatever. I make this argument, homosexuality is wrong, right? And I'll make this argument on the basis of, like, I'll make natural law arguments. I'll make sort of empirical historical arguments about the trajectory of cultures and their decline and things like that, whatever. And then my interlocutor will say something like, no, there's no such thing as human nature. You can't make this natural law argument. These aren't real categories. These are historical constructions, right? And it's like, okay, I can somewhat sympathize with that view. I understand that view or whatever. This is drawn from nominalism again. I started with the French Revolution here, but this goes to back to nominalism as well. But So I can understand that argument. The problem is that nominalism carried through to its conclusions is Nietzscheanism. You wind up in Nietzscheanism, which is right wing. You don't wind up, because what is said next, it's like these aren't real categories, and so you can't make a natural law argument to argue that this is wrong. Morality is culturally relative, or it's subjective. It's historically determined by discursive power formations. Blah 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 blah. And then the next thing that's said is, and so it's very morally wrong to discriminate. These are, individual people's preferences. People are autonomous agents willing their own lives. They should be free to make their own choices. This is the kind of life that this person wants to live or whatever. It's wrong to discriminate against them. You can't do that. You can't jump from this nominalist historicist critique of essences, right? Of any kind of stable ontology. You can't jump from there to it's wrong to discriminate. It's wrong to discriminate is rooted in the idea that you can know something about the essence of human beings. That they're autonomous, free individuals who should make their own choices, et cetera, et cetera. You're committing yourself with these normative prescriptions to a metaphysics that you just exploded, right? And so this is sort of the fundamental situation that everybody on the, not everybody again, but basically everybody on the left is in, right? Marx, just to have a kind of side moment, there is some critique, right, of Enlightenment metaphysics in Marx. However, it's not as thoroughgoing. I would still call Marx basically an Enlightenment thinker. I would say that he still basically subscribes to a kind of Enlightenment metaphysics in important ways. This is like a lengthier discussion, maybe a chapter in the book or whatever. But he isn't really guilty of these problems. A traditional Marxist wouldn't really be guilty, because they do subscribe to the idea that there's a universal human nature, right? They do subscribe to the idea that secular rationality can apprehend the truth about a stable world that exists, whatever, etc. However, the modern left doesn't. They don't think that. They can't, because all of the emphasis is on the normativity, right? If you can't have sort of infinite inclusiveness and stable ontology. It doesn't work. And so if you have an unstable ontology, if it's chaos, if this is all historical, discursive formations, there's no such thing as essences. These are all just names that we apply to things arbitrarily for whatever reasons, et cetera, then you can't have the normative commitments, right? You wind up in a Nietzschean position. Nietzsche is not going to promote equality between men and women or something like that. He's going to say something like, men and women, those are artificial categories. He wouldn't say this exactly. I think it's an implication of some of, what is said in Nietzsche, whatever. But the philosophical implication of Nietzscheanism is that men and women, man and woman, are lies. Those are lies. They obscure reality. These are artificial, verbal, linguistic constructions of human beings that create a kind of fantasy world of illusion or whatever, but it doesn't capture reality. We're not talking about reality when we're talking about what a man is and what a woman is, right? These are discursive formations, right? And so if these are merely discursive formations, it doesn't make sense to talk about equality between men and women, right? And so you just can't have both of these things going at the same time. This was more rambly sort of than I wanted it to be, but I thought it would be sort of interesting as a check-in. There's a lot more to this story. But anyway, that's one of the things I've been working on. I've been working on a few other things. Maybe I'll talk a little about them in a different episode, but take care for now. Remember to think culture, not simply react or whatever.